I was counting the rivets on the southern support when I realized one of them was wet above the waterline, even though the tide had been calm for hours. That detail shouldn't have mattered, but it sat wrong in my head, like a word you repeat until it loses meaning. The night shift always does that to you out here, stretching time and thinning your thoughts until small things feel heavier than they should. I'd been on the rig long enough to know there were 11 strange rules you followed if you wanted to finish your contract breathing, and I'd followed them without question until that moment. I touched the railing, felt the vibration under my palm, and understood I'd already broken one. I didn't know yet what it would cost me, only that the ocean had noticed. The first time I heard Rule 1, never look directly down the supports during the night shift. It wasn't written anywhere official, just something a senior watchman muttered while handing me the binoculars with a look that suggested he'd once failed to listen. I laughed then, because oil rigs are full of superstition, and because looking down is part of the job, whether they like it or not. You check for structural damage, drifting debris, anything that could turn into a reportable incident by morning. Still, his hand lingered on my wrist a second too long, and he told me that if I ever felt tempted to lean over the railing at night, I should step back and count to 30 instead. I remember thinking that was an oddly specific number, and I didn't ask why. On my first solo night shift, the rule came back to me as more of a suggestion than a warning, something easy to ignore when boredom starts gnawing at your skull. The rig settles into a rhythm after midnight, a low vibration that crawls through your boots and into your bones, making it hard to tell where your body ends and the structure begins. I walked my route, checked the gauges, logged the readings, and told myself I was alone in the safest possible way. That's when I noticed the water below wasn't reflecting the floodlights the way it should have, the blackness swallowing the glow instead of scattering it. I leaned forward without thinking, just a few inches, and remembered Rule 1 halfway through the motion. I stopped myself, gripping the cold metal until my knuckles hurt, and laughed softly at my own nerves, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. The sea does strange things at night, everyone knows that, and isolation has a way of amplifying harmless details into personal threats. Still, I counted to 30 like I'd been told, each number dragging longer than the last, and stepped back once I was done. The feeling that followed wasn't relief so much as disappointment, like I'd missed something important without knowing what it was. That bothered me more than the darkness itself. The next few nights passed without incident, which only made the rule feel smaller, easier to forget, until it started to feel silly to pretend I didn't need to look down there. I told myself that Rule 1 was probably born from someone dropping a tool or losing their footing, a safety concern that had grown teeth through repetition. On the fourth night, a storm rolled in slow and quiet, the kind that presses humidity into your lungs without giving you rain as an excuse. The wind pushed at the rig just enough to make the supports groan in a way you felt through your spine. I leaned over again, slower this time, careful to keep my center of gravity back, and looked straight down. What I saw wasn't movement exactly, more like the absence of it, a shape that didn't disturb the water as it rose along the metal. My brain tried to supply explanations faster than my eyes could adjust. Algae bloom, shadow, debris riding a current that wasn't on the charts. The longer I stared, the less those explanations fit, because the shape seemed to pause whenever I blinked, as if waiting for me to commit to seeing it. I remembered Rule 1 then, not as a sentence but as the weight in that older watchman's hand, and I stepped back hard enough to bark my shin on the railing. I told myself I'd imagined it, that fatigue and the storm had teamed up to mess with my depth perception, and I logged the moment as nothing at all. That was the real mistake, not the looking but the pretending afterward, the choice to fold the experience into myself instead of sharing it. Out here, silence feels like professionalism, and admitting fear feels like weakness you can't afford. When my relief came on shift change, I didn't mention the supports or the shape or how my hands had shaken afterward. I just nodded, signed off, and went to my bunk with the sense that something had climbed a little closer while I wasn't watching. I slept poorly that day, dreaming of metal ladders stretching down into water that never met the bottom, and woke up before my alarm with my heart racing for no clear reason. The storm had passed by the time I was back on duty, leaving the sea deceptively calm, the surface smooth enough to reflect the rig like a broken mirror. I forced myself to avoid the railing, to honor Rule 1 as it was meant to be honored, but the urge to look had taken on a life of its own. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted downward on instinct, like a tongue worrying a sore spot. The isolation made it worse, the sense that if I didn't witness whatever was happening, no one else would. Near the end of the shift, I felt it again, that subtle wrongness in the vibration under my boots, a change too small to measure but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. I stayed back this time, fingers digging into my pockets, whispering Rule 1 to myself like a prayer I didn't quite believe in anymore. The supports loomed just beyond my peripheral vision, and I was suddenly certain that whatever had been there before was still there now, waiting for me to make the same choice twice. The clock ticked forward, the night thinned toward morning, and I stood frozen, knowing the rule had already changed me, even if I'd followed it. Something about the rig felt closer than it had any right to be, and I couldn't tell if that was paranoia or the beginning of understanding. The way Rule 2. If you hear something scraping the supports, never use the floodlights to find the source, was explained to me came back in pieces, not as a warning, but as a memory I didn't realize I'd stored. I was walking the east perimeter when the sensation under my boots shifted again, subtle enough that I wondered if I'd imagined it out of habit. Then there was that dragging pressure through the metal, not loud or sharp, just persistent, like weight being moved without urgency. My hand went instinctively to the light controls, and that was when the sentence surfaced in my head, incomplete but heavy. I froze there, fingers hovering, realizing I'd reached this moment before without knowing it. The first time anyone mentioned Rule 2, it was during a maintenance overlap, 2 crews sharing the rig for a single uncomfortable afternoon. One of the temporary guys asked why the floodlights were angled outward instead of straight down, joking that someone must be afraid of what they'd see. The supervisor didn't laugh, just told him that the lights were positioned like that for a reason, and left it at that. Later in the mess, someone quieter leaned across the table and said, "You don't shine light on things that already know where you are." I remember rolling my eyes then, thinking it sounded rehearsed, like a line passed down, because no one wanted to be the one to break tradition. Standing there on the night shift, that half-remembered advice pressed against my ribs harder than the scraping did against the supports. The sensation moved in short bursts now, pausing as if testing for resistance, and each pause made my skin tighten. I told myself it was probably debris, a loose cable, something mechanical that would look stupid once illuminated. The problem was that Rule 2 didn't say not to investigate, just not to use the lights, and the distinction felt important in a way I couldn't articulate. I stepped back from the controls, letting my hand fall to my side, and tried to listen with my whole body instead of my ears. The isolation of the rig does strange things to your perception, stretching small sensations until they feel intentional, personal. I crouched and pressed my palm flat against the deck, feeling the vibration travel up my arm in uneven pulses. It wasn't rhythmic enough to be machinery, not random enough to be water alone, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. My radio crackled with a routine check-in from control, and I answered automatically, keeping my voice steady while my eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the railing. I didn't mention the scraping, didn't mention Rule 2, because saying it out loud felt like admitting I believed in it. The dragging sensation climbed higher, closer to where the supports met the platform, and with it came the urge to break the rule just to reclaim a sense of control. Light is supposed to be the solution to fear, the thing you use to turn unknowns into manageable facts. I thought about how ridiculous it would sound to explain later that I hadn't turned on the floodlights because of a superstition. My thumb brushed the switch again, and I remembered the quiet guy in the mess saying some things don't need help finding you. I pulled my hand away, like the metal was hot, and took a step back, heart pounding harder than it had during the storm. Without the lights, the darkness felt thicker, more deliberate, and my mind filled it with shapes I didn't want to examine too closely. I tried to reason through Rule 2, to find the logic hidden inside it, telling myself maybe sudden light changes could disorient wildlife or cause accidents. That explanation fell apart when the scraping stopped entirely, replaced by a stillness that felt like attention. I realized then that the sound had been a warning in its own way, an announcement of presence that didn't require confirmation. The supports loomed just beyond the reach of the outward-facing lights, and whatever was there remained politely unilluminated. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds, time flattening out until it was just me and the waiting. I shifted my weight, boots squealing faintly against the deck, and felt the vibration respond, a subtle adjustment, as if something had noticed the movement. The urge to run warred with the responsibility drilled into me by training and repetition. I stayed where I was, reciting Rule 2 in my head like a checklist item, reminding myself that following it meant I was still doing my job correctly. The thought didn't comfort me the way it should have. When the scraping resumed, it was closer, the sensation sharper now that I'd had silence to compare it to. I backed away slowly, careful not to make sudden movements, my eyes fixed on the line where metal met dark water. My radio buzzed again, another routine call, and this time I hesitated before answering, worried that speaking might count as breaking some unspoken extension of the rule. I responded anyway, because pretending everything was normal felt safer than explaining why it wasn't. The voice on the other end sounded tired and distant, anchored to a world that suddenly felt very far away from mine. I made it to the central platform without turning on the lights, every step measured, every instinct screaming at me to look, to confirm, to know. The scraping faded as I moved, not following exactly, but not staying behind either, and that ambiguity was worse than pursuit. By the time I reached the interior, my hands were shaking hard enough that I had to sit down, pressing them between my knees until they steadied. I told myself I'd followed Rule 2 perfectly, that whatever consequence existed would belong to someone else now. The thought didn't stick, sliding off the deeper realization that rules like this don't protect you so much as they delay recognition. I sat there longer than necessary, listening to the familiar hum of the rig and trying to convince myself it hadn't changed. When I finally stood, there was a new mark on the deck near the railing, shallow and uneven, like something heavy had tested the surface and decided against it. I didn't need the floodlights to see that, and I didn't want them anymore. As I logged the shift, my eyes kept drifting to the supports on the camera feed, half expecting movement, half afraid of stillness. Rule 2 had done its job, but it left me with the unsettling sense that whatever was climbing had learned something about me too. By the time Rule 3, never acknowledge anyone who speaks to you from below the deck after midnight, made itself known to me, I had already started doubting my own reactions to things, which I think is the point where the rig really gets its grip on you. I was still keyed up from the scraping, nerves stretched thin enough that every normal vibration felt suspicious. Midnight had passed without ceremony, just a quiet tick on the log and a shift in the air that felt heavier than before. I was leaning against the interior bulkhead, trying to convince myself to step back outside, when I heard my name spoken clearly from somewhere under the deck. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't urgent, which somehow made it worse. At first I assumed it was the radio, some crossover of voices bleeding through the metal like it sometimes does when conditions are right. I checked the unit clipped to my vest, but it was silent, the indicator light steady and unbothered. The voice came again, closer this time, sounding like someone standing just below my boots, speaking up through the floor plating. It used my name the way people do when they know you'll answer, casual and familiar, without a hint of strain. My mouth opened before my brain caught up, and that's when Rule 3 surfaced, not as a memory but as a physical resistance, like my jaw had hit an invisible barrier. I'd never been formally told Rule 3, not in a briefing or a warning, but fragments of it floated up from old conversations I'd dismissed. A night supervisor once joked that if the rig starts talking back, you should pretend you've gone deaf. and everyone laughed a little too hard. Another time, during a safety drill, someone mentioned that all personnel were accounted for above deck after dark, and that if you thought otherwise, you should check the roster again. None of it had stuck until the moment it mattered, when my own name echoed softly through steel. I swallowed whatever response had been forming and pressed my lips together, heart thudding hard enough to make me lightheaded. The voice didn't stop when I stayed silent, which tested my resolve more than if it had. It shifted tone, becoming concerned, asking if I'd dropped something, if I needed help with the rounds. Each sentence was perfectly reasonable, the kind of thing a coworker might say if they thought you were distracted. I found myself mentally scanning the roster, counting faces, convincing myself someone must have been cleared to work below deck late. But Rule 3 was there now, fully formed in my mind, and it insisted that the problem wasn't who was speaking, but where the voice was coming from. I backed away from the sound, boots scuffing softly, careful not to give any sign that I'd heard it at all. Isolation does strange arithmetic with your thoughts, adding weight to things that shouldn't matter and subtracting certainty from things that should. The voice followed me as I moved, always directly below, never louder or softer, as if distance didn't apply the way I expected it to. It started asking questions that felt designed to pull me in, reminding me of small shared details, a joke from the mess hall, a complaint about the coffee. I clenched my hands until my nails bit into my palms, grounding myself in the sensation, repeating Rule 3 over and over like a lifeline. Answering felt like it would be easier than resisting, and that frightened me more than the voice itself. At one point, it laughed quietly, not mocking but indulgent, like someone amused by a child's stubbornness. That sound made my skin crawl in a way the scraping never had, because it carried understanding, an awareness of my hesitation. I wondered how many times this had happened before, how many watchmen had stood where I was, weighing politeness against survival without realizing it. The rig creaked around us, normal settling noises blending into the background, and I had the sudden thought that if someone were listening from above, they wouldn't hear anything out of place. Rule 3 isolates you in more ways than one, cutting you off not just from the voice, but from the idea of being overheard. I reached the ladder leading up to the higher platform and paused, knowing that climbing would change something, though I couldn't have said what. The voice noticed the hesitation immediately, asking if I was stuck, if the ladder was giving me trouble again. It used the word again, like we'd shared this moment before, and a wave of disorientation washed over me, memories blurring at the edges. For a second I almost believed I had answered already, that this was just the continuation of a conversation I couldn't fully recall. I squeezed my eyes shut, took a slow breath, and held on to Rule 3 as the only solid thing left. When I climbed, the voice stayed beneath me, rising in pitch as the distance should have increased, matching my movement in a way that made no physical sense. It began to sound impatient then, the words tightening, losing their easy cadence, and I felt a strange misplaced guilt for not responding. That emotion surprised me more than anything, because it suggested I still saw the voice as a person who could be offended. I reminded myself that midnight on the rig draws the boundaries of what counts as human interaction, and that Rule 3 exists because acknowledging is a kind of permission. Each rung felt longer than the last, my muscles burning as if I were climbing against resistance. By the time I reached the upper platform, the voice had fallen silent, which should have been a relief but wasn't. The absence felt deliberate, like a pause taken for effect, and I found myself straining to hear it again despite myself. I leaned against the railing, chest heaving, and stared out at the dark water, resisting the urge to look down the supports in the same motion. The rig felt emptier than it ever had, every familiar surface suddenly unreliable. I whispered Rule 3 under my breath, not because I needed the reminder, but because I needed to hear my own voice anchored in my body. I logged the incident in the vaguest terms possible, describing nothing more than a momentary distraction, my pen shaking as I wrote. There was no category for voices from below the deck, no checkbox for rules you aren't supposed to explain. As the shift crept toward morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been learned during that exchange, not by me but about me. Silence, I realized, isn't just the absence of response, it's a signal in its own right. When dawn finally thinned the darkness, I knew Rule 3 had already followed me somewhere I couldn't leave behind, and that the rig would remember the sound of my name even if I pretended not to. The transition into Rule 4. If you find wet footprints on dry metal, do not try to match them to any crew member, was so seamless that I didn't realize a new rule had taken hold until I was already breaking it in my head. The silence after the voice faded didn't lift. It settled thick and deliberate, pressing down on every familiar sound until even my own breathing felt intrusive. I stepped back inside to log another round, telling myself routine would pull me out of the spiral, and that's when I saw the footprints near the maintenance hatch. They were dark, clearly wet, each one sharply defined against the otherwise dry deck plating. I stood there too long, staring, and felt the night narrow around that simple fact. At first I told myself they were mine, even though I knew better, because claiming ownership felt safer than admitting uncertainty. The size looked close enough, the spacing almost right, and my mind rushed to smooth over the discrepancies before I could examine them properly. I crouched and placed my boot near one without touching it, comparing angles, pressure points, the way the toe dragged slightly inward. That was when Rule 4 surfaced, not as a warning, but as a deep unease, the sense that this kind of comparison crossed an invisible line. I pulled my foot back slowly, heart sinking as I realized how instinctive the urge to measure had been. No one ever sat me down and explained Rule 4, but I remembered a story told half seriously during a safety refresher about a watchman who'd insisted on playing detective instead of reporting and moving on. The way it was told, the emphasis wasn't on what he found, but on how convinced he became, how certain he was that the footprints belonged to someone he knew. The punchline had been that certainty is more dangerous than ignorance out here, because it gives you confidence without protection. Standing over those prints, I understood that the rule wasn't about politeness or protocol, but about preserving doubt. Doubt, uncomfortable as it is, keeps you from stepping closer than you should. The footprints led away from the hatch in a direction that didn't make sense, angling toward the outer walkway before stopping abruptly. There were no smears, no signs of slipping, just a clean end as if whatever made them had lifted off the deck without effort. I found myself mentally scrolling through faces, matching gait and boot tread, a reflex I couldn't fully shut down. Each imagined match brought a brief, sickening relief, quickly followed by the realization that I'd just rewritten reality to make it less frightening. Rule 4 pressed harder then, urging me to stop turning evidence into reassurance. I straightened up and forced my gaze away, focusing instead on the clock, the gauges, anything with numbers that didn't care how I felt. The problem was that the footprints were still there in my peripheral vision, anchoring my thoughts no matter how hard I tried to drift. I thought about calling it in, about waking someone up with a report that would sound ridiculous in daylight. The words jammed in my throat before I could speak them, because explaining would require interpretation, and interpretation would mean breaking Rule 4 out loud. I stayed silent, telling myself that silence had worked before, even as doubt gnawed at that assumption. As minutes passed, the wet sheen on the metal didn't evaporate the way it should have, another detail my brain tried to downplay. I told myself the humidity was high, that conditions were strange, that physics didn't owe me comfort. Still, the longer the footprints stayed intact, the more they felt intentional, like a message left unfinished. I wondered if acknowledging them at all counted as a kind of response, a recognition that might be enough. The rig seemed to lean into that thought, the vibration under my boots shifting just enough to feel like anticipation. I whispered Rule 4 to myself, not as a command, but as a reminder of where not to look. Eventually, I forced myself to move on, stepping carefully around the prints without crossing their path. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the deck resisted me in small, stubborn ways. I didn't look back once I passed the corner, afraid that seeing them again would tempt me into another comparison. When I finally checked the camera feed from that area later, the footprints were gone, the metal dry and unmarked, offering no proof that they'd ever existed. That absence unsettled me more than their presence had, because it suggested timing mattered more than I'd understood. I finished the shift with a hollow ache behind my eyes, the kind that comes from holding too many thoughts at bay for too long. Rule 4 had done what the others had done, narrowing my options without offering clarity, teaching me how not to think instead of what to do. As dawn crept in, pale and thin, I realized I was starting to catalog my own reactions the way I'd wanted to catalog the footprints, looking for patterns that might explain me to myself. That realization felt dangerous in a way I couldn't quite define. The rig had given me another rule, and with it, another way to doubt my own perspective, and I sensed that whatever came next would take advantage of that hesitation. By the time Rule 5, if the cameras show movement that doesn't match the timestamp, don't report it, became unavoidable. I was already relying on the cameras more than my own senses, which I think is how the rig prefers it. After the footprints vanished, I told myself the feeds were safer than my eyes, objective in a way memory isn't. Screens don't get tired, don't imagine things, don't hesitate out of fear or politeness. I settled into the control nook with a mug I hadn't realized I'd filled, and watched the grid of live views flicker gently in the low light. That's when I noticed one feed lagging behind the others by a fraction I couldn't quantify. At first it was subtle, a delay so small I thought it was just my attention skipping, like a scratched record. I switched between cameras, counting silently, trying to line up movements across screens the way I'd been trained to. One support camera showed the water shifting, the reflection breaking, and then a breath later, the same shift appeared again in the same frame. The timestamp in the corner didn't change, stubbornly fixed as if nothing had happened at all. My first instinct was to log it, to do what the job demands and flag irregularities before they compound. That instinct collided head-on with Rule 5, which surfaced with the weight of something remembered too late. I'd heard fragments of Rule 5 before, usually framed as a joke about the cameras, seeing ahead of us, a way to explain glitches without paperwork. A technician once told me that if the system starts disagreeing with itself, you let it win, because it's the only thing down there that sees everything at once. I'd laughed then, grateful for a mundane explanation, but now the humor drained out of it. The movement on the screen repeated again, the water parting around the support in a way that felt rehearsed. I hovered over the keyboard, cursor blinking like a pulse, and felt a familiar pressure build behind my eyes. The longer I watched, the more the discrepancy widened, not in seconds but in meaning, as if the camera was replaying a decision rather than an event. I checked the system clock, the backup feed, everything that could anchor me to sequence and order. All of it agreed with itself, presenting a united front that left the moving image isolated and undeniable. Reporting it would mean inviting someone else into that isolation, asking them to stand where I was standing. Rule 5 insisted that doing so would only spread the problem, like copying a file you don't understand and wondering later why it corrupted everything else. I leaned back and tried to ground myself in physical sensation, the hum of equipment, the faint warmth of the console under my palms. The camera feed shifted again, this time showing the support empty for a split moment before the water closed back in. The timestamp never flinched. I felt an urge to rewind, to test the footage against itself, but that felt like another kind of report, a way of insisting on explanation where none was offered. I remembered how Rule 5 wasn't about ignoring anomalies, but about refusing to fix them into a narrative that could be passed along. Some things, it seemed, were meant to stay singular. As the night wore on, the feed began to feel less like a window and more like a memory replayed incorrectly. Details in the wrong order, emphasis in the wrong places. I found myself anticipating movements before they happened, my body tensing just ahead of the screen, as if I'd already seen this version somewhere else. That realization unsettled me deeply, because it suggested the camera wasn't lagging behind time, but brushing up against it from another angle. I whispered Rule 5 under my breath, not to stop myself from reporting, but to remind myself that acknowledgement takes many forms. Watching, I realized, might be enough. Eventually the feed stabilized, the water returning to its familiar patterns, the support just another vertical line in a grid of lines. The timestamp advanced as if nothing unusual had occurred, the system closing ranks around its own version of events. I sat there longer than necessary, reluctant to move, afraid that stepping away would let something slip through unseen. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, like I'd been riding out turbulence instead of sitting still. Rule 5 had kept me from speaking, but it hadn't kept me from knowing. I logged the shift with careful neutrality, my notes clean and unremarkable, a record of compliance rather than experience. As I shut down the console, I caught my reflection in the darkened screen, my face slightly delayed by the glass, features misaligned, just enough to look unfamiliar. The thought struck me then that time on the rig isn't always a straight line, and that sometimes the safest thing you can do is let it bend without comment. I turned away from the cameras, carrying Rule 5 with me like a secret I hadn't chosen, aware that whatever the feeds had shown was now part of me whether I'd reported it or not. The moment Rule 6. If someone asks you to confirm what you saw on the cameras, deny it completely came into focus. It didn't arrive as a warning so much as a demand placed gently on my shoulders. I had just stepped out of the control nook, still carrying the afterimage of that delayed feed in my head, when my radio buzzed with a call that wasn't part of the usual schedule. Control wanted clarification on a minor discrepancy. Nothing urgent, just a routine follow-up on the last shift's logs. The casual tone should have reassured me, but instead it tightened something in my chest. I already knew what they were circling around, even though they hadn't named it yet. I answered, keeping my voice steady, listening as the supervisor spoke in careful, neutral phrases. He mentioned a brief system hiccup flagged automatically, asked if I'd noticed anything unusual on the support cameras overnight. The word unusual hung there, open-ended, inviting interpretation, and with it came the full weight of Rule 6. I remembered a conversation from months back, a senior watchman explaining that the cameras don't just record, they provoke, and that the worst thing you can do is agree with them out loud. At the time, I'd assumed he meant false positives and paperwork headaches, not something deeper and more personal. I told Control I hadn't seen anything worth mentioning, that the feeds behaved as expected, given the conditions. The lie slid out easier than I'd expected, polished by repetition before it ever reached my mouth. As I spoke, I watched my own reflection in a nearby panel, half expecting it to lag the way the footage had, but it stayed obediently in sync. Control accepted the answer without comment, the conversation moving on to mundane details about handover times and maintenance notes. When the channel went quiet again, I felt a strange mix of relief and shame settle in, like I'd passed a test I didn't remember signing up for. The problem with Rule 6 isn't the denial itself, but what it teaches you about trust, especially your own. Once you've said you didn't see something, it starts to feel less solid, less entitled to space in your mind. I replayed the camera feed in my memory, checking for flaws, exaggerations, anything that could justify the denial retroactively. Each pass made it fuzzier, the edges blurring until I couldn't be sure whether the delay had been real or just an impression formed under pressure. The rig thrums steadily around you when this happens, providing a comforting backdrop that makes doubt feel reasonable and silence feel responsible. Later in the shift, another call came in, this one from a coworker I trusted more than most. He asked casually how the night had been, whether anything strange had come up, his tone light but curious. For a second I considered telling him, framing it as a joke or a glitch, something we could roll our eyes at together. That hesitation was all it took for Rule 6 to assert itself again, sharper this time, insisting that partial truths are just slower ways of confirming. I shrugged it off verbally, told him it was quiet, uneventful, the kind of night you barely remember afterward. He laughed and agreed, and I felt the distance between us stretch in a way I couldn't measure. As the hours crept by, I started to notice how often questions like that come up on the rig, how frequently people probe gently at the edges of each other's shifts. It's a way of staying connected out here, of building a shared sense of reality that keeps everyone anchored. Rule 6 cuts against that instinct, asking you to prioritize containment over connection, to let experiences die in isolation. I found myself avoiding eye contact, keeping conversations brief, afraid that any hint of hesitation might invite another question. The loneliness that followed wasn't sudden or dramatic, just a slow erosion of ease I hadn't realized I depended on. The irony is that denying what you saw doesn't make it go away, it just changes where it lives. Without witnesses, the memory settled deeper, replaying itself at odd moments, intrusive and unresolved. I'd catch myself glancing at the cameras again, not to check for anomalies, but to reassure myself they were behaving, that time was flowing correctly. Each normal feed felt like a small victory, proof that the lie hadn't broken anything essential. Still, Rule 6 lingered, reminding me that confirmation is contagious, and that I was now part of the system that prevented it. Toward the end of the shift, Control called one last time to sign off, their voice professional and distant. As I responded, I realized how practiced I'd become at sounding unremarkable, how easily I slipped into the version of myself that the rig required. There was a comfort in that, a sense of safety in blending into expectations, even as it hollowed something out inside me. Rule 6 had taught me that survival here isn't just about avoiding what climbs the supports or speaks from below, but about choosing which truths are allowed to circulate. That knowledge sat heavy and cold, like metal against skin. When dawn finally thinned the darkness, I left the control area feeling older than I had at the start of the night, burdened by a silence I'd actively maintained. The cameras continued their watch without me, impartial and patient, holding on to whatever they'd seen, whether anyone admitted it or not. I knew then that Rule 6 would follow me beyond this shift, shaping how I answered questions I hadn't been asked yet. As I stepped away, the thought that unsettled me most wasn't that I'd lied, but that the lie felt necessary. Something on the rig had taught me when to deny my own eyes, and I wasn't sure how to unlearn that. The shift after I learned Rule 6 bled into the next, without a clean edge, exhaustion blurring my sense of sequence, until everything felt like one long night. I was moving along the outer walkway again, slower now, more careful about where I placed my hands, when the vibration changed abruptly beneath my boots. It wasn't stronger or weaker, just different, like a muscle twitching instead of breathing. My first instinct was to reach for the nearest support, to brace myself the way you're trained to, when balance goes uncertain. That reflex stopped halfway through my arm, arrested by the sudden clarity of Rule 7. If you notice the supports vibrating without warning, do not try to steady yourself against them. I don't remember who first mentioned Rule 7, only that it was said casually, as if it applied to a very narrow, unlikely situation. Someone had joked about the rig shrugging sometimes, the supports shivering like they were tired of holding everything up. The advice that followed was framed as practical, about avoiding pinched fingers or sudden shifts in weight. Standing there now, with the metal humming in a way that felt purposeful, I understood that the real danger wasn't injury. It was contact. I pulled my hand back and widened my stance, letting my knees absorb the motion instead of the structure. The vibration traveled upward through the supports in uneven waves, pausing and resuming as if something was testing the limits of the metal. Without the anchor of touch, I felt strangely exposed, my balance dependent on my own muscles instead of the rig's solidity. I focused on my breathing, keeping it slow and shallow, afraid that too much movement might draw attention. The urge to grab on grew stronger with each pulse, a whisper of panic insisting that connection meant safety. I repeated Rule 7 silently, forcing myself to trust the ground beneath my feet, even as it betrayed its usual predictability. As seconds stretched, I noticed the vibration wasn't random. It seemed to respond to me, intensifying slightly whenever I shifted my weight. That realization sent a cold spike of understanding through me because it suggested awareness, a feedback loop I hadn't consented to. I froze, muscles burning, holding myself upright without support while the rig trembled around me. The ocean below remained deceptively calm, the surface unbroken, offering no visual explanation for what I felt. In that moment, Rule 7 felt less like advice and more like a boundary, a line drawn to keep me from completing some unspoken circuit. The vibration eased eventually, fading back into the familiar background hum as if nothing had happened. I waited longer than necessary before moving again, testing the deck with careful steps, resisting the urge to pat the support reassuringly like you might a living thing. My hands shook with leftover adrenaline, and I shoved them into my pockets to keep from acting on impulse. The rig felt watchful then, not in a dramatic way, but with the quiet patience of something that knows you'll make a mistake eventually. Rule 7 had kept me upright, but it had also taught me how much I relied on touch to feel real. Later, during a brief overlap with the incoming watch, someone commented offhandedly that the rig had felt off earlier, like a bad engine idle. I nodded and agreed, careful to keep my response vague, denying myself even that small confirmation. The memory of the vibration replayed in my body more than my mind, a phantom sensation in my palms that made me flex my fingers. I wondered how many of the rules existed solely to limit contact, to keep us from completing gestures that felt natural but carried consequences. Rule 7 lingered as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is try to steady yourself. As the shift wound down, fatigue settled over me like a second skin, dulling the sharp edges of fear without erasing them. I found myself leaning away from supports automatically now, giving the rig a wider berth than before. That change felt permanent, a recalibration of instincts that would follow me even on shore. The vibration hadn't returned, but the absence felt temporary, like a pause rather than an ending. Walking away, I had the unsettling sense that the rig knew I'd learned something important, and that it was waiting to see how I'd use it. By the time Rule 8, never investigate dripping water that appears where it shouldn't, settled into my awareness, the rig had begun to feel less like a machine, and more like an organism, breathing slowly beneath my boots. I was rounding the east side again, tension in my shoulders, when I noticed a steady drip along one of the inner bulkheads. At first I dismissed it. Condensation, maybe a routine leak from a pipe above, but the sound was precise, deliberate, like a metronome keeping time I wasn't supposed to follow. My hand twitched toward the source, curiosity pushing against instinct, and that's when Rule 8 asserted itself fully, a quiet but insistent pulse in my memory telling me to step back. I remembered a previous watchman casually mentioning a strange leak that no one could locate for weeks. Pipes intact, no sign of corrosion, no explanation, and he swore it moved around the deck on its own. I'd laughed then, thinking it a story meant to make newcomers uneasy, a superstition passed down to scare the naive. Standing there now, with each drip hitting metal and reverberating under my soles, the humor drained away. The drops fell in uneven intervals, shifting as if guided by some internal rhythm I couldn't parse, and my skin prickled with the knowledge that Rule 8 wasn't about pipes or maintenance. It was about boundaries I wasn't meant to cross. The urge to trace the source was immediate and violent, pulling my eyes down the wall, over the supports, toward the dark corners of the rig I usually ignored. My training screamed at me to check everything, ensure there was no hazard, but Rule 8 warned that some hazards are not mechanical. I stood rigid, counting breaths, each one lengthening as my mind tried to rationalize the drip. A loose seal, a condensation line, a tiny leak in the hull. Each explanation faltered when I realized the water pooled and vanished, without following any predictable path, as though it obeyed rules entirely separate from physics. The drip sound seemed to shift depending on my attention, louder when I glanced directly, softer when I looked away, and I began to wonder if the rig itself was aware of my focus. I thought about shining my flashlight along the wall, tracing the droplets back, imagining myself solving a simple problem, but that would have broken Rule 8. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs instead, grounding myself, whispering the rule like a mantra. The tension didn't ease. It stretched into the silence, making the rig feel denser, the air tighter, my senses on edge. Something about not knowing the source felt heavier than fear itself, a weight that didn't dissipate with rational thought. Minutes or maybe hours passed. I couldn't tell. The dripping eventually stopped, leaving only the memory of its rhythm echoing faintly in my head. I tried to convince myself it was over, that stepping away meant safety, that Rule 8 had protected me without me needing to test its limits. But as I walked back along the walkway toward the control room, a chill followed me, the sense that the water hadn't disappeared. It had only retreated, waiting for the next time I might falter. That subtle warning stayed with me longer than any vibration or ghostly voice, and I knew the lesson of Rule 8 would follow me deeper into the night than the drip ever could. By the time Rule 9, never step onto a support platform that looks wet, even if it's dry, under the lights became clear, the rig had already claimed hours of my awareness, leaving me attuned to minor details that used to escape me. I was walking toward the southern support when I noticed a subtle sheen along the metal grating, catching the floodlights in an almost deliberate glimmer. My brain argued it was a trick of the lighting, that the surface was perfectly dry, and yet the shine seemed wrong, as if it existed independently of reflection. My boots hovered over the threshold for a long moment, heart thumping against ribs that felt too small, and the memory of Rule 9 pushed me backward before I could make contact. The first time I'd heard Rule 9, it was whispered during orientation by a veteran watchman who had the same dead look in his eyes the older guys carried when they told stories that weren't meant for newcomers. He had said simply, "Some surfaces look safe. Don't trust your eyes. Don't trust your feet." I'd nodded politely, thinking it hyperbole, a way of exaggerating the risks of wet decks and slick surfaces. Now, as I stared at that support, the words weighed heavier, more urgent, as if the rig itself was echoing the warning. The platform looked solid, familiar, and safe, but my gut screamed that confirmation would be a mistake. Every instinct screamed to step forward, to check stability, to reconcile what I saw with what I felt underfoot. But Rule 9 demanded that I resist. That observation alone be enough. I crouched slightly, shifting my weight to keep my center low, watching the pattern of light on the metal, noting the way shadows moved over the grating. The glimmer seemed to pulse subtly, synchronous with the vibrations I'd felt on previous shifts, and I realized the platform's apparent dryness might be a lure rather than a truth. Stepping on it, even tentatively, felt like acknowledging a challenge I couldn't hope to win. As I lingered, the tension built in my chest, muscles tensing, fingers gripping the railing behind me, as though the rig could sense hesitation and respond. I imagined what had happened to those who ignored the rule. The stories passed down in hushed tones. Watchmen who had vanished, crew who had fallen silent, unexplained accidents that were never logged. Each imagined scenario reinforced the imperative to obey Rule 9, even though curiosity clawed at my consciousness, testing my ability to hold still. I repeated the rule under my breath, a talisman against the pressure to move forward, against the almost magnetic pull of the wet-looking surface. Eventually, I backed away, careful to maintain slow, measured steps, resisting the temptation to look again. The platform gleamed under the floodlights until I was out of sight, the shine lingering like a promise or a threat. I couldn't tell which. My hands were damp with sweat, heart still hammering, and I realized that Rule 9 wasn't just about stability. It was about perception, about the rig teaching you that trust is sometimes the deadliest thing you can offer. By the time I reached the inner walkway, the illusion of safety had faded, leaving only the persistent knowledge that surfaces can lie, and that rules exist to keep you from testing their patience. The way Rule 10, if the rig asks you to verify a head count, assume the number is wrong, entered my life wasn't through a warning or a story, but through an automated prompt that should never have appeared on my console. I had just come in from the outer walkway, legs stiff, thoughts still snagging on the sheen of that support platform, when the screen blinked and displayed a routine request. It asked me to confirm personnel presence by section, a standard check tied to shift transitions and safety audits. The problem was that there was no transition scheduled, no audit pending, nothing that should have triggered the request. I stared at the list of names longer than necessary, feeling a slow, unfamiliar dread settle into my stomach. I tried to convince myself it was a delayed process, some leftover task kicked loose by the earlier camera irregularities. Systems on the rig aren't perfect, and paperwork ghosts happen more often than anyone likes to admit. Still, Rule 10 surfaced immediately, not as a memory, but as a certainty, as if I'd always known what to do in this situation, and was only now being tested. I remembered an old supervisor saying that when the rig starts counting people, it isn't trying to help you. At the time, I'd assumed he meant bureaucratic nonsense, but standing there with the list glowing softly, the meaning felt sharper and more personal. The names on the screen were familiar, too familiar, including my own and those of people I knew were off shift or on shore. My instinct was to reconcile the list, to cross-reference rosters and correct the error, because accuracy is drilled into you from day one. But Rule 10 pushed back hard against that instinct, insisting that correction was the trap. I scrolled slowly, noting the total at the bottom, a number that felt slightly too high, like a room that seems crowded even when everyone is standing still. The rig thrummed around me, steady and patient, as if waiting for my input. I thought about how head counts work, how they're meant to reassure, to provide a snapshot of safety and order. Out here, numbers are comfort, proof that everyone is accounted for and nothing has slipped through the cracks. Rule 10 undermines that comfort by suggesting the count itself is compromised, that the act of verification creates something it claims to measure. My finger hovered over the confirmation key, the urge to resolve the discrepancy almost overwhelming. It felt wrong to leave the request unanswered, like ignoring someone calling your name in a crowded room. A memory surfaced then, uninvited, of a safety drill years ago when a temporary worker asked why head counts were always confirmed verbally as well as digitally. The trainer's response had been vague, something about redundancy and human oversight, but his eyes had darted away as he spoke. I realized now that redundancy wasn't about catching mistakes, but about diluting responsibility, spreading the act of acknowledgement thin enough that it didn't stick. Rule 10 clarified that if the rig presents you with a number, accepting it gives the number weight, reality. Denying it, even silently, keeps it unstable. The request blinked again, the screen subtly dimming and brightening, as if reacting to my hesitation. I felt an odd pressure behind my eyes, the same sensation I'd had watching the camera feed slip out of sync, a sense of being slightly ahead of myself. I imagined what would happen if I confirmed the count, if I stamped the rig's version of reality with my approval. The thought carried an unexpected guilt, as if I'd be agreeing to something at someone else's expense. Rule 10 didn't explain who that someone might be, only that the cost wouldn't be abstract. I minimized the window without responding, a small act of defiance that felt larger than it should have. The console accepted it without protest, returning to its usual display, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. I stood there, hands resting on the edge of the desk, listening to the rig's constant presence through vibration rather than sound. The list of names lingered in my mind, especially the ones that didn't belong, faces attached to absences that suddenly felt less certain. I wondered how many times before someone had confirmed a head count and never noticed what changed afterward. Later in the shift, Control called again, their tone professional, asking me to run through a quick verbal confirmation of personnel in my section. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, and Rule 10 flared back to life, urgent and unmistakable. I answered with the standard line, reporting only myself present, keeping my voice even. There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy, before Control acknowledged and moved on. I couldn't tell whether they were satisfied or disappointed, and that ambiguity sat poorly with me. After the call, I checked the console again, half expecting the head count request to reappear. It didn't, but something else had changed. A small indicator showing system status glowed a different color than I remembered. I told myself it had always been that way, that fatigue was playing tricks on me, but the doubt wouldn't settle. Rule 10 echoed in my thoughts, reminding me that numbers aren't neutral, especially in places where isolation magnifies every discrepancy. Out here, being counted can mean being claimed. As the night deepened, I found myself subconsciously counting anyway, tracking footsteps in adjacent sections, noting radio check-ins, building my own private ledger. Each time I reached a number, it felt provisional, subject to revision without warning. The rig seemed to encourage that uncertainty, presenting small inconsistencies that kept me recalculating. I wondered if this constant recounting was the real danger, a way of keeping your mind occupied while something else moved unobserved. Rule 10 had warned me about trusting the rig's count, but it hadn't said anything about trusting my own. Near the end of the shift, I passed a reflective surface and caught a glimpse of myself that made me stop. For a split second, it felt like the reflection hesitated, not enough to be obvious, but enough to raise the question. I stared longer than I should have, counting breaths, heartbeats, grounding myself in sensation. The reflection behaved after that, but the doubt lingered, quiet and corrosive. I thought about the headcount list again, about my name among others, and wondered what it meant to be included by default. When dawn finally began to thin the darkness, the rig felt crowded in a way I couldn't explain, as if space itself had been reduced without moving any walls. I packed up my things slowly, avoiding the console, avoiding numbers, avoiding confirmation of any kind. Rule 10 had left me with a suspicion that once the rig starts asking who is present, it's already too late to answer safely. As I stepped away, a new notification blinked briefly on the screen behind me, gone before I could read it, and I had the unsettling sense that whatever count the rig was keeping, it no longer needed my input. By the time Rule 11, if a hatch closes behind you on its own, never turn around to open it, made itself known. I had already learned that the rig doesn't just challenge your body, it tests your mind in ways that leave no evidence for logic to cling to. I was walking toward the lower maintenance deck, fatigue pressed into my shoulders, eyes stinging from the constant artificial light, when the hatch above me swung closed with a subtle shiver of metal. It wasn't the creak of a hinge under stress, or the sound of wind through an ill-fitting seam. It was precise, deliberate, almost expectant. My first impulse was to reach back, to push it open, but the rule hit me like a physical wall. Rule 11. Don't turn around, don't interfere. I remember the first time someone mentioned it, decades ago in hushed tones over coffee in the break room. A senior watchman said it casually, as if sharing a mundane piece of advice, but the look in his eyes suggested otherwise. Hatches don't just close, he said. Not on a rig like this, and if one does, it's testing something in you. Curiosity, impatience, instinct. I had laughed at the time, thinking it a superstition, something to scare rookies. Now, with my back facing the sealed metal, I understood the weight of those words. The urge to check, to see if it was a glitch or a leftover draft, was a pressure I couldn't entirely resist. My muscles twitched in anticipation, but I clenched my jaw, whispering Rule 11 like a lifeline. The rig seemed to thrum around me as if it knew my hesitation, vibrations rippling through the floor and railings in uneven pulses. The air smelled faintly metallic, a clean scent tinged with salt, and it reminded me of how small I really was in this place. Every other anomaly I had witnessed, the voices, the wet footprints, the delayed feeds, felt like practice for this moment, testing my ability to resist instinct. I imagined what would happen if I turned, if I ignored the rule, and my mind supplied a dozen silent, impossible scenarios. Each was worse than the last, a careful layering of consequences, designed to make hesitation itself dangerous. I waited, my heartbeat synced with the rig's subtle vibrations, each pulse a reminder that movement isn't always neutral. Minutes stretched with the weight of centuries, or so it felt, my gaze locked on the floor, my mind racing through the consequences of ignoring Rule 11. The sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, a leftover echo from earlier rules, seemed to amplify, marking the passage of time in a rhythm that belonged only to this space. I felt a creeping certainty that the rig had noticed my thoughts, that my own imagination could be observed and judged. Resisting the impulse to turn became a conscious act of survival. I considered radioing control, explaining the hatch, seeking validation or instruction. but Rule 11 had taught me that acknowledgement is invitation. Verification is permission. Speaking would make whatever watched me more real, more immediate, more capable. I pressed forward, steps cautious, chest tight, imagining the hatch as a living entity that waits patiently for mistakes. Every part of me screamed to glance back, to open, to intervene, but I kept moving, feeling the distance stretch as I committed fully to obedience. By the time I reached the next section, the vibration from the hatch had ceased, leaving only residual tension in my muscles and a lingering awareness at the back of my mind. The rig felt quieter, more settled, yet I couldn't shake the impression that it was watching in a way that didn't need eyes. Rule 11 had left a scar across my instincts, teaching me that some openings are not meant to be crossed, some doors not meant to be reopened. I pressed on, heavier than before, every step measured, knowing that the rules had culminated in this lesson, but that the consequences were ongoing, not concluded. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.